February 1946. Lucky Luciano had 3 weeks before deportation to Italy. The man who'd unified the Mafia and transformed organized crime into a business system was leaving America permanently. The government's deal was simple: help with the war effort, get your sentence commuted. Luciano delivered, using his dock connections to secure shipping lanes during the conflict. But the price was exile. Permanent exile. The 5 families were stable. Frank Costello ran the Luciano family in his absence. Vito Genovese schemed from Italy, hungry for power but unable to act without Luciano's blessing. Albert Anastasia controlled the docks. The labor unions were paid off. The politicians were bought. The police were on the payroll. Everything was in order. Except one piece of the puzzle remained unsolved: Harlem. The numbers racket made millions every single week. Nickels and dimes from poor people betting on 3-digit numbers, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this week they'd hit and finally buy their kids shoes or pay rent without begging their landlord for mercy. The house always kept the money that didn't win. And in Harlem, the house had always been controlled by black operators who understood the community, who lived there, who had skin in the game. That power structure was changing. Dutch Schultz had tried to take Harlem in 1935. He'd sent dozens of men, spent millions on violence and intimidation, used his money and political connections to muscle in on black operations. He'd failed. Completely. A young enforcer named Bumpy Johnson had driven him out. Not through conventional warfare that matched his strength, but through something far subtler, through understanding that Harlem's real power came not from guns, but from community trust. From respect earned through loyalty, not fear. Schultz had died a few years later, shot by other gangsters who decided he was too reckless, too unpredictable. But the lesson remained embedded in the underworld: you could not conquer Harlem the way you conquered other territories. Luciano understood this in a way that Schultz never had. Luciano was a businessman first, a gangster second. He calculated risk like an accountant calculated numbers. He understood systems. He knew that sometimes the best way to take something was not to take it at all, but to make a deal so attractive that the other person thought they were winning. So on February 12, 1946, Lucky Luciano sent word to Bumpy Johnson through intermediaries: "Let's meet. Let's talk business." Bumpy didn't respond for a week. That silence alone told Luciano everything he needed to know about the man he was dealing with. This wasn't someone who could be rushed or intimidated into urgency. This wasn't someone who jumped when a bigger name called. This was someone who made other men wait. Someone who understood that patience itself was a form of power. When the response finally came, it was simple and direct: the Stork Club. Friday night. 8 o'clock. The Stork Club on East 53rd Street was the most exclusive nightclub in Manhattan. Frank Sinatra performed there when he wanted privacy. J. Edgar Hoover drank there. It was a place where old money and new power mixed, where deals were made in back rooms and alliances were formed over martinis and French champagne. On February 18, 1946, Lucky Luciano reserved the entire VIP room for the evening. No other patrons. No exceptions. He brought 6 men with him: Frank Costello, his acting boss, the man who'd been keeping things stable while Luciano was in prison; Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, the man who'd built an empire on violence and absolute loyalty; Meyer Lansky, the accountant, the mathematical genius who'd turned organized crime into a legitimate business structure; 3 bodyguards who'd killed more men than most soldiers ever would in combat. 7 men total. All of them armed. All of them dangerous. All of them representing the combined power of the Italian Mafia in New York City. They arrived at 7:45 p.m. The VIP room was prepared. Soft lighting from crystal chandeliers, a private bar, expensive whiskey and vodka, a table positioned so that whoever sat at the head had a perfect view of the door. The position of absolute power. Luciano sat at the head. Costello to his right. Anastasia to his left. Meyer Lansky settled into a position with a clear view of the entrance. The three bodyguards positioned themselves at strategic points, by the door, near the bar, in the corner, watching, waiting, ready for anything. They waited in silence. No one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, electric. At exactly 8 p.m., the door opened. Bumpy Johnson walked in alone. He was 40 years old, but he moved like a man much younger. He carried himself with the ease of someone completely comfortable with who he was. He was dressed in a tailored three-piece suit, navy blue with a crisp white shirt beneath. No tie, he never wore ties. A gold watch chain hung from his vest pocket, catching the light as he moved. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His hair was freshly cut, shaped with precision. He carried a leather briefcase in his right hand, brown leather, well-worn but well-maintained. The bodyguards tensed immediately. Hands drifted toward weapons. Eyes narrowed as they assessed threats in milliseconds. This black man walking into the room where the heads of the Italian Mafia were gathered was, by their calculations, a threat. But lucky Luciano raised one finger. Just one. The bodyguards stopped. Not fully relaxed, but stopped. Bumpy walked past them without a glance, didn't even seem to notice they existed. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor, steady, unhurried, confident. He walked straight to the table and pulled out the chair at the head of the table. The seat usually reserved for the boss. The seat that, by all rights and all traditions, should have been occupied by lucky Luciano himself. He sat down. He placed his briefcase on the table in front of him, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a cigar. Not a cheap cigar. A good one. The kind you had to know how to get, had to have connections to acquire. He tapped it on the table to loosen the tobacco, brought it to his lips, and lit it with a silver lighter. The smoke curled upward in the dim light, drifting toward the ceiling. Nobody in the room moved. Frank Costello's jaw tightened so much you could see the muscle working beneath his skin. Albert Anastasia's hand drifted slowly toward the automatic in his shoulder holster. Meyer Lansky's fingers stopped drumming on the table. The three bodyguards looked at each other, unsure whether to move, unsure what their boss wanted them to do. But lucky Luciano just smiled. It was a small smile. A knowing smile. The smile of a man who'd spent 40 years reading other men, understanding what they were doing before they did it, predicting their moves like a chess grandmaster 10 steps ahead. And in that smile was something almost like respect. Because Luciano recognized exactly what Bumpy Johnson was doing. This wasn't disrespect. This wasn't crude arrogance. This was a test. Bumpy was establishing the terms of the conversation before anyone said a single word. He was demonstrating that in this negotiation, he wasn't the one who needed anything. He was the one who had something to trade. Something valuable enough that Luciano himself had to come and ask for it. Luciano took the seat directly across from Bumpy. The other men, seeing that the boss wasn't angry, settled back into their chairs. The tension didn't disappear completely, but it shifted. It became something else. Anticipation. Curiosity about what would happen next. "Mr. Johnson," Luciano said, his voice calm and measured. "Thank you for coming." Bumpy took a long drag from his cigar and blew the smoke toward the ceiling. He didn't respond to the thanks. He didn't acknowledge the courtesy. Instead, he simply looked at Luciano with eyes that were completely empty of emotion. Eyes that showed nothing. No fear, no respect, no deference. "You said you wanted to talk," Bumpy said quietly. "So talk." Luciano folded his hands on the table. His fingers were long and thin, the hands of a man who'd never done physical labor, who'd always been able to delegate the violence to others. When he spoke, his voice was the voice of someone used to being listened to. someone used to his words matching. "I'm leaving the country in 3 weeks," he said. "The feds are shipping me back to Italy. Permanent deportation. But before I go, I need to make sure New York stays in order. No wars. No chaos. Just business. Clean business. Profitable business." Bumpy nodded slowly. Said nothing. "Harlem is the last piece of the puzzle," Luciano continued. "The numbers racket is making millions every single week. My people want in. And I know you've been running things up there since Schultz died. You've got the trust of the community. You've got the infrastructure. You've got the police on your payroll. You've built something real." Luciano paused, looking Bumpy directly in the eyes. "I'm not here to take what's yours, Bumpy. I'm here to offer you a partnership." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the tone of someone making a reasonable business proposal. "You keep running Harlem. You maintain complete control. You collect the money, manage the runners, handle the local politics. In return, we provide protection from federal interference. We provide investment capital so you can expand. We provide connections to the banking system so you can move large sums without attracting attention from the IRS or other federal agencies. We provide legal help when your runners get arrested. We provide everything you need to expand without risk." Luciano sat back. "In return, we take 40% of the profits." The room was silent. You could hear the faint sound of jazz music filtering in from the main club. The clink of glasses. The murmur of voices from the regular patrons. But in this room, there was only silence. Frank Costello leaned forward slightly, watching Bumpy's reaction. Meyer Lansky's fingers began drumming softly on the table again. Albert Anastasia cracked his knuckles, a sound like breaking branches. They were all waiting to see how this man, this black man from Harlem, would respond to an offer from Lucky Luciano. Bumpy took another drag from his cigar. He let the smoke drift up toward the ceiling before he spoke. "What happens if I say no?" he asked. Luciano's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. Not angry cold. Not even threatening cold in an emotional way. Just the cold of absolute certainty. The cold of a man who'd never been told no by anyone and had no reference point for what that would mean. The cold of someone who'd ordered the deaths of hundreds. "Then we have a problem," Luciano said quietly. "Because if you're not with us, you're against us. And nobody survives being against us." It wasn't said with anger. It wasn't said with heat or passion. It was said with the absolute certainty of a man who'd built an empire on that exact principle. A man who'd survived wars, prison, federal investigations, all because he understood one fundamental truth: power isn't about being the nicest or the smartest or the most ethical. It's about being the most willing to do what others won't. Bumpy set his cigar down in the crystal ashtray provided by the club. He opened his briefcase. The room tensed again. Every hand moved slightly closer to weapons. Every body shifted, preparing for violence. From the briefcase, Bumpy withdrew a single photograph. He didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate. Calculated. Each gesture carried weight. He set the photograph on the table and slid it across toward Luciano. Luciano picked it up. His face didn't change. But his fingers tightened around the edges of the photograph until his knuckles went white. You could see the muscles in his hands tense. See the calculation happening behind his eyes. The photograph showed a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn. One of Anastasia's main gambling operations. The kind of place that made millions. In front of the warehouse, clearly visible despite the distance and angle, was Albert Anastasia, shaking hands with a man in a police uniform. A police captain. A high-ranking official. The image was clear. Unmistakable. "That was taken 3 days ago," Bumpy said quietly. His voice was calm, almost conversational. I've got 12 more just like it. Different warehouses. Different cops. Different members of your organization. All of them breaking the rules they're not supposed to break. All of them making deals they shouldn't be making. Frank Costello's hand moved toward his jacket. Albert Anastasia stood up halfway out of his chair, his face flushed red with anger or embarrassment or both. But Lucky Luciano just stared at the photograph and then at Bumpy Johnson. Are you threatening me? Luciano asked. No, Bumpy said. His voice was calm, matter of fact. I'm showing you respect. He leaned forward. Because I could have sent these photographs to the district attorney. I could have sent them to the newspapers. I could have burned your whole operation to the ground before you even knew I had them. The feds would have been on you in 24 hours. You'd have been back in prison by the end of the week. Your empire would have collapsed like a house of cards. Bumpy sat back. But I didn't. He picked up his cigar again and took a slow drag. You came to Harlem asking for partnership. But partnership means equals. What you just offered me wasn't a partnership. It was a takeover with a smile. It was you telling me I could stay in charge as long as I paid you for the privilege. Meyer Lansky was watching this exchange like a man watching a master class in negotiation. His eyes were bright with interest. Luciano set the photograph down on the table. For the first time since Bumpy had entered the room, he looked genuinely impressed. So what do you want? He asked. Bumpy picked up his cigar. He took a slow drag. He let the question hang in the air for a long moment. Then he spoke. You want what Schultz wanted. What every Italian crew that's ever looked at Harlem wanted. Control. But you can't have it. Not because you're not smart enough. Not because you're not strong enough. Because Harlem isn't yours to control. It never was. Bumpy pointed toward the window, toward the lights of uptown Manhattan visible in the distance. You know why Schultz failed? Because he thought black people were stupid. He thought we'd just hand over our money and say thank you. He thought that muscle was enough to conquer a neighborhood. But Harlem doesn't work that way. You need trust. You need respect. You need to be one of us. And you'll never be one of us. Frank Costello started to speak, but Luciano raised his hand and silenced him with a look. Bumpy continued. But here's what I will do. You asked for 40%. You can have 10. 10% of the profits, not as protection money, but as a service fee. You provide banking support. We need clean money to pay winners when the heavy numbers hit. Sometimes we need to move large sums, and your banking connections help us do that without attracting attention from the IRS. You provide legal help when our runners get arrested. When a city cop tries to shut us down, we have a lawyer on speed dial. In return, you get 10% of the net. Clean money. Low risk. No exposure. Bumpy's voice dropped an octave. And one more thing. You never, and I mean never, send your people into Harlem to collect. You never send soldiers into my streets to shake down my runners. You never show up with guns and muscle trying to intimidate my community. You want your money, you send a courier to my office. One man. I'll have it counted, wrapped, and ready. But your soldiers don't patrol my streets. Your guns don't show up in my neighborhood. Harlem stays black. Harlem stays mine. That's the deal. The silence that followed was absolute. Meyer Lansky broke it. He turned to Lucky Luciano, and a small smile appeared on his face. Charlie, Meyer said. That's actually a smart play. 10% for essentially no risk. No overhead. No exposure. No risk of federal heat. It's clean money. And the banking structure he's describing, it's actually more efficient than what we've been doing. Albert Anastasia wasn't convinced. And what's to stop him from cutting us out once we set up the banking? Anastasia asked. What's to stop him from deciding he doesn't need us anymore? Bumpy answered before Luciano could speak. The same thing that stops you from trying to take Harlem by force, he said. A stalemate. You try to cheat me, those photographs go public and your political protection evaporates. You'll have federal indictments within a month. I try to cheat you, you come after me. With everything you've got. We both lose or we both get rich. Your choice. Bumpy pulled out another photograph from his briefcase. This one showed Frank Costello with a city councilman. And another showing Vito Genovese with a federal judge. All of them engaged in business that shouldn't be happening. I've got 14 photographs total, Bumpy said. Not to threaten you. To remind you that I'm not playing this game from a position of weakness. I'm playing from a position of information. And information, in this business, is more valuable than guns. More valuable than money. Lucky Luciano stared at Bumpy Johnson for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly, he started to laugh. Not a mocking laugh. Not a dismissive laugh. A genuine laugh. The laugh of a man who couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Who found himself, for the first time in decades, sitting across from someone who was truly his equal. You know what, Bumpy? Luciano said, still laughing. Schultz was an idiot. He should have talked to you first. Luciano stood up and extended his hand. 10%. Banking and legal support. No soldiers in Harlem. You deliver the money monthly. We have a deal. Bumpy stood and shook his hand. One firm grip. No hesitation. Just two men acknowledging each other. Frank Costello exhaled. Meyer Lansky smiled. Even Albert Anastasia sat back down, the tension bleeding out of the room. Lucky Luciano held onto Bumpy's hand for an extra second. Let me tell you something, Bumpy, he said. I've done business with presidents. I've done business with cops. I've done business with union bosses and killers and politicians and judges. But you're the first man who came to my table and told me no without pulling a gun. That takes guts or stupidity. I haven't decided which yet. Bumpy smiled. A rare, genuine smile. When you figure it out, he said, let me know. 3 weeks later, Lucky Luciano boarded a ship bound for Italy. He never set foot in America again. But the deal he made with Bumpy Johnson held. For 22 years. When Bumpy was arrested in 1951 and sent to Alcatraz, Frank Costello, by then the acting boss of the Luciano family, stepped in. Bumpy's family was taken care of. Monthly payments. Lawyers. Protection. No one was left behind. When Bumpy walked out of prison in 1963, everything was still in place. The money was waiting. The connections were alive. That agreement lasted until Bumpy's death in 1968. The meeting at the Stork Club became legend in the underworld. Not because of violence. There was none. Not because of threats. But because two men from different worlds sat down and found a way to do business without destroying each other. Before that night, white gangsters believed they set the rules. Harlem was something to be taken. Dutch Schultz came with money and guns, expecting conquest. Bumpy Johnson proved him wrong. Not with force. With intelligence. Lucky Luciano understood this. He survived not because he was stronger, but because he understood systems. Sometimes the best way to win is to let the other side believe they already have. Years later, Luciano told associates. Bumpy Johnson was the smartest gangster I ever met. The most dangerous. Because he didn't need my respect. He demanded it. Bumpy never spoke publicly about that meeting. The terms stayed secret. But in his office, a photograph hung on the wall for years. Not as a threat. As a reminder. A reminder of what real power is. Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in 1968 at the Lenox Lounge. A king. Because he understood something most never did: real power isn't in the gun. It's in information. That's why they called him the Godfather of Harlem.